We'll start the unit on disinfection, and we should be able to complete that this week. And what I've been trying to do is kind of move you through the treatment process. So before distribution, one of the last steps is disinfection. So we'll talk about water disease and disinfection. We'll look at disinfection regulations. And just as a comparison, I'll give you, we'll talk about disinfection regulations in the US and New Zealand, so that you have a sense of how different countries approach disinfection. We'll look at the properties of different disinfectants, and then what we call the CT concept in the US and disinfection design. So when we're looking at disinfection, we're looking at eliminating human enteric pathogens to a level that doesn't result in human disease. We're not sterilizing the water. The water may very well still have bacteria in it and likely will have bacteria. But the idea is that it doesn't have enteric pathogens. So this lists some of the different organisms that we look at controlling in drinking water systems. E. coli is an organism that is present in mammalian intestinal system. It is in every one of us. It's important in terms of maintaining an ecosystem within the intestinal system to ensure that you have proper digestion of food. 0157 is a particular strain. So when we talk about any organism, we talk about family level, we talk about genus, we talk about species, and then we talk about strain. Most strains of E. coli are harmless. In fact, they're in many cases essential. The 0157 strain can be deadly. We'll look at this a little bit more. It produces toxins. Those toxins are pathogenic and can cause very serious disease, and in some cases, death. Vibrio cholera is the organism that causes cholera. WHO, the World Health Organization, estimates that about 120,000 deaths per year are actually due to Vibrio cholera. There are a number of waterborne viruses. These include the adenovirus, hepatitis A and E, rotavirus, norovirus, and coxsackie viruses. We're not going to talk in any great detail about any of these, but as you can see, there are a number of these viruses that are waterborne. There are also protozoa. In 1993, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, there was a major storm event, a process upset, resulting in the distribution of water that contained Cryptosporidium oocysts. And this is the oocyst right here. It's an extremely stable state of the organism. It resulted in approximately 100 deaths and over 100,000 people became sick. Giardia is also another protozoan organism. Giardia and Cryptosporidium both are two of the more common waterborne diseases from drinking waters, like on backpacking trips where the water isn't properly disinfected, and also from swimming pools. Amoebic cysts are also important as a waterborne disease. Endomoeba histolytica is an important organism, especially near the equator, in these warm environments. it's part of the life cycle is in the snail. So actually one of the things that has been done to try and control this is to control the snail population. The other one that you may have heard of recently, Naegleria fowleri. This is the one that's referred to as the brain-eating amoeba. It's actually harmless if it's swallowed. However, if it's inhaled through the, through the nose, it gets into the nasal passages. From the nasal passages, it gets into the brain. And it is about 98% deadly. It's about 99% preventable. So if we can prevent it, we can easily prevent illness and death, but we have to make sure that we're preventing it. Now, we can ask the question, do we disinfect or not? And this question was asked back in 2018. I was doing my sabbatical in Christchurch. And in 2016, they had had a major outbreak in a village called Havelock North. It was caused by E. coli 0157. There were 5,000 that became ill, 45 hospitalized, and 4 deaths. As a result of that, the Ministry of the Environment mandated chlorination of drinking water systems. Christchurch was using groundwater. It had about 57 pump stations. It pumped water directly from those pump stations into the distribution system without treatment. No corrosion control, no chlorination. And as a result of a mandated study that was done, the ministry said there are concerns about the piping network distribution system, partly because of issues resulting from the 2010 and 2011 earthquakes that hit Christchurch. So there were concerns about breakage in pipes, in some of the pump wells heads being below the flood level. So they mandated chlorination. People went ballistic. Some supported it, but a lot didn't. We have this issue of, do we disinfect or not? Their concern there was predominantly with disinfection byproducts, and even more so, the taste. So you see the cancer risk, and that really pertains to disinfection byproducts. This question that was just asked is, so even if UV disinfection is done, must there be some sort of chlorination system? In the US, for surface waters, and we'll talk about this next, but in this, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the surface water treatment rule, chlorine residuals are mandated. It's not mandated for groundwater systems, but it is mandated for surface water systems. So yes, in the US, even if UV system disinfection is done, if it is a surface water system or a groundwater under the influence of surface water, some chlorine residual is required. That is not true, or has not been true, in New Zealand. This table is from the New Zealand guidelines for drinking water management. I use it because it gives us a sense of the number of cases of various different waterborne diseases. You can see here, and I haven't highlighted it, but the one that causes the most number of cases is actually Campylobacter. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So the other, and that's increasing, what we're seeing is a significant increase in disease caused by cryptosporidium or cryptosporidosis. You see an increase in Giardia, waterborne diseases from Giardia. Legionella, you see almost a doubling. Now, Legionella is interesting because the Legionella is not from consuming drinking water, it's from inhaling water that contains the Legionella bacteria. So showering would be a likely route of exposure because during the shower, the shower is producing small droplets, aerosolized particles, and then you have the potential to inhale those aerosolized particles containing Legionella. One of the concerns right now with COVID is that a lot of buildings have been closed. There's the potential for Legionella to proliferate in these stagnant piping systems. And then what do we do to make sure that we protect this population from exposure to Legionella once the building is open? And then lastly, you see VTEC and STEC. These are V for virotoxin and the S for shigatoxin. These are from E. coli. So these are the E. coli strains, as I mentioned. 0157 is one of them. And you see an increase in numbers there too. This is indicative of what we see across the world. It's the same thing in the US. This is a table, it's from the same document, on documented waterborne outbreaks. So you can see Campylobacter, another one. I said 0157, I apologize, it's not, it was Campylobacter that was the cause of the Havelock North outbreak. What's the source? Anybody want to venture to, anybody know anything about New Zealand? Agriculture is extremely important. In fact, at one point, I think there was 30 sheep for every one person. It's now about 7 sheep for every one person in New Zealand. So you have a significant agricultural industry, both sheep, dairy, and to some extent, swine. You have a significant amount of manure that has to be dealt with. If that manure gets into the drinking water system, there is the potential exposure. So Campylobacter is found in the guts of birds, especially poultry, cattle, sheep, cats, dogs. And if the food becomes contaminated, then it causes illness. In the US, it's believed to result in about 1.5 million illnesses per year. It's a gram-negative bacteria, and it's the most common cause of diarrheal illness in the US. So looking at drinking water regulations, it might be surprising to you to realize that it wasn't until 1986, 34 years ago, that all public water supplies are required to disinfect. Groundwater systems are required to disinfect. They're not required to maintain a disinfection residual because the requirement to maintain disinfection residuals is under the surface water treatment rule. In 1989, this rule was promulgated, and the goal was to protect against Giardia, viruses, and Legionella. The goal was to inactivate 99.9% of Giardia, and Giardia is a cyst, and 99.99% of viruses. This we will talk about as 4-log removal. So you'll see, we'll talk about this later in the tables for disinfection, and this is 3-log removal. The stage 1 disinfection and disinfection byproduct rule was not promulgated until 1998. And that set maximum contaminant levels for trihalomethanes, haloacetic acids, bromate, and chloride. And we'll look more at these as we look at various different disinfectants. But it's relatively recent that we had regulations in the US for disinfection byproducts. And for instance, with the trihalomethanes, actually, and haloacetic acids and bromate, these are either known carcinogens or suspected carcinogens in humans. The contaminant levels are set based on ingestion. They are not set considering inhalation, purely ingestion. Also set maximum contaminant residuals for chlorine, chloramines, and chlorine dioxide. So prior to that, there was no maximum residual set in the US. The interim enhanced surface water treatment rule in 2002, after the Milwaukee incident, mandated the removal of cryptosporidium, and that was at 2-log removal. In 2006, the stage 2 disinfectant and disinfection byproduct rule changed the monitoring to reduce disinfection byproduct maximum. So the way we monitor for disinfection byproducts is quarterly, and it's in the distribution system at locations where, based on knowledge of the distribution system and hydraulic modeling, the water age is likely to be the highest, which means that there's a greatest potential for formation of disinfection byproducts. The longer the water is in the distribution system, the greater the opportunity for these reactions to occur and the more likelihood of higher concentrations. It also reduced the levels from total trihalomethanes to 80 and haloacetic acids, and there's 5 of them, to 60. And the way this is measured is with what's referred to as a longitudinal locational average. So for instance, in Flint, back in December of 2014, the city of Flint had been monitoring, and they had very high levels of trihalomethanes in a number of locations. The Ben Eagle issued a warning to the city that they needed to adjust their treatment system to reduce their levels. They hadn't yet exceeded the regulatory limit because there hadn't been force at quarters of measurements, but they wouldn't exceed the limit if they didn't change their water treatment system, which they did, and they did bring down the levels. The long-term 2 enhanced surface water treatment rule set limits for the removal of crypto based on the number of oocysts in the raw water. And this is in terms of log removal. So this changed back in 2002. It was only 2-log removal. In 2006, that was increased to at least 4 or 5-log removal. And that's based on the treatment used and bin allocation. And that's based on the sampling. So when we go through this, it'll make a little more sense when we actually work through the problem, the example problem. But based on the water quality and at least 24 months of sampling, one measures or monitors the source water for cryptosporidium, based on the levels observed, the source water is placed into what we call bin. And that mandates the level of removal. Another fact about Flint was if you don't do the sampling, you're automatically in the highest bin, in bin 4. For some reason, and it's never been clear to me why, they neither did the sampling nor were they placed, the source water placed in bin 4, as was initially stated in some of the documents before they switched water. Now in New Zealand, the regulations are different. They initially monitored for fecal coliforms, and that was an indicator of fecal contamination. So coliforms are a type of gram-negative bacteria. They have replaced that with E. coli, so they're actually measuring E. coli directly. They have included cryptosporidium in the compliance section. They have introduced monitoring requirements for ozone and chlorine dioxide disinfection to meet these requirements. And they removed Giardia from the CT tables when using chlorine. And the reason they did that is because cryptosporidium is much more resistant to chlorination than is Giardia. So if you can show that you've got sufficient inactivation of cryptosporidium oocysts, you would have sufficient inactivation of Giardia. So it was just considered redundant because it's much more, Giardia is more susceptible to chlorination than is crypto. Just to give you a sense of the importance of chlorination, it's actually been considered one of the most significant medical breakthroughs in the world. We don't see it as a medical breakthrough, but it had a significant impact on human health. In 1905, filtration was first implemented routine in the US, Philadelphia. And then in about 1908, chlorination was begun. And you can see that between filtration and chlorination, there has been a significant decrease in the death rate of typhoid fever. And this is before the introduction of penicillin and other antibiotics. So it really is the treatment of water that has had a significant impact. This table has compared disinfection efficacy in New Zealand and the US. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see that there are differences. So for instance, in the US, for bacteria, it's stated that less than 5% of samples can be positive for total coliforms in a month. And actually in the summer of 2014 in Flint, that value was much higher than 5%. If there is a total coliform positive, then that sample or that location must be analyzed for fecal coliforms or E. coli. In New Zealand, it's set as 1 E. coli per 100 ml. So it's not this percentage in a month. New Zealand has no regulations for viruses. The US has 4 log removal. In New Zealand, for crypto, and it's based on crypto, then less than one infective oocyst per 100 liters. The US, we're basing it on Giardia. We want 3 log removal or inactivation, and we control crypto predominantly by watershed protection. And Legionella, there is actually no regulations for Legionella in New Zealand or the US. The assumption is that if we protect against Giardia and viruses, then Legionella will be controlled. And we could talk in depth about whether or not that is a good assumption or not.